The United States and China have extended a truce in their trade war until November, postponing massive tariff hikes just hours before they were due to come into force. In a statement posted on the White House website, President Trump said that during discussions, China has taken significant steps towards remedying non-reciprocal trade arrangements and addressing the concerns of the United States relating to economic and national security matters. This is the second time that Mr. Trump has delayed imposing tariffs, having done something similar in May. The move allows the world's two largest economies another 90 days to reach an agreement. China's state news agency, Xinhua, says this means the 10% tariffs on U.S. imports will remain in place, while many Chinese exports to the U.S. currently face 30% tariffs. Peter Borse, North America correspondent, reports that this extension is not a huge surprise. Negotiations between China and Washington had been sounding more optimistic recently, and the 3-month suspension will be welcomed by many U.S. retailers. The timing is critical, especially heading into the holiday season when imports from China typically surge. Without the extension, there were fears of massive tariffs being passed on to consumers. U.S. government figures show that imports of Chinese goods in June were about half of what they were a year earlier. In the first 6 months of this year, the U.S. imported $165 billion worth of goods from China, down roughly 15% from the same period last year. Over the same period, American exports to China were down by about 20% year on year. Laura Bicker, China correspondent, says the extension was expected given that talks were progressing well. However, there are sticking points to a longer-term deal. China has a stranglehold over rare earth minerals, critical for products like smartphones, cars, and wind turbines, controlling 70% of the global supply. The U.S. wants access to these, while China wants access to advanced computer chips, which the U.S. has been restricting. These two issues remain key obstacles. China has also prepared for a second Trump presidency by diversifying its markets since the first trade war. Now, only about 20% of its business is with the U.S., with more trade directed toward the global South, including South America and Southeast Asia. This diversification makes China less dependent on the U.S. market, which it may now see as unstable. U.S. perspective and reactions. Peter Borse, the BBC's North America correspondent, said the decision to grant a further 3-month suspension was not unexpected. Over recent weeks, the tone of discussions between Beijing and Washington had become more optimistic, with both sides signaling a willingness to find common ground. This delay, Borse noted, will be especially welcomed by U.S. retailers, many of whom had been bracing for higher import costs in the lead-up to the year-end holiday shopping season. The timing is critical for American businesses. The holiday period, from late November through December, sees a surge in imports, especially consumer electronics, clothing, toys, and seasonal goods manufactured in China. Without the extension, retailers could have been forced to pay steep, triple-digit percentage tariffs on many of these products, costs that would almost certainly have been passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. U.S. government trade figures show that imports of Chinese goods in June were about half of what they were a year earlier. In the first 6 months of this year, the U.S. imported $165 billion worth of goods from China, down roughly 15% from the same period last year. Over the same period, American exports to China were down by about 20% year on year. China's perspective and negotiation sticking points. BBC China correspondent Laura Bicker explained that the extension had been widely anticipated, as early reports from the negotiating teams suggested talks were moving in a constructive direction. However, she also highlighted that major obstacles remain before a comprehensive trade deal can be reached. One of the most significant sticking points is China's dominant position in the global supply of rare earth minerals, a group of 17 elements essential to the production of high-tech goods, from smartphones and electric vehicles to renewable energy equipment such as wind turbines. China currently controls about 70% of the world's supply, giving it significant leverage in trade talks. On the other side, China is pressing for greater access to advanced computer chips, which are critical for modern electronics and artificial intelligence systems. The U.S. has been restricting the sale of its most sophisticated chips to China, citing both competitive concerns and national security risks. These two issues, rare earths and advanced semiconductors, remain among the most contentious topics in the negotiations. China has also prepared for a second Trump presidency by diversifying its markets since the first trade war. Now, only about 20% of its business is with the U.S., with more trade directed toward the global South, including South America and Southeast Asia. This diversification makes China less dependent on the U.S. market, which it may now see as unstable.